So now we'll move on to kind of general population information about Latin America. And one of the big things is just kind of put it in global context. So in 2011, the world's population hit 7 billion. And right now we're at about 7.1 billion people in the world, right? So that's the global population. And if we look at the breakdown in terms of population in millions, so China has 1.3 billion, India has 1.2 billion, and the United States has 317 million currently. Latin America actually doesn't come out as highly populated. So the only Latin American country in the top 10 most populous countries in the world is Brazil, although Mexico does come in at number 11 or 12 depending on the year. So it's important to realize that really Asia comes in as kind of a heavyweight in terms of its total share of the global population. If we look at the history of population, this comes from the UN report from about 10 years ago, but it shows kind of the growth in population and some forecasts here. From the year 0, which is CE, the current era, or AD, depending on whether you go with the old way of talking about this or the new way. And if we look at from then until today, in just over 2,000 years, global population has expanded from around 3 million people to over 7 billion. That's crazy, because we're looking at 2,000 years, and an increase by that much is pretty impressive. And forecasts are that by the year 2200, global population will be just over 10 billion. However, just after this, global populations are predicted to stabilize. So the ability of the human species to repopulate the Earth will be roughly equal to the rate at which we die off. So at that point, we'll have around 10 billion people as a steady state. But you should keep in mind that those estimates assume only slight increases in longevity. So right now, the average lifespan of a person in the developed world is somewhere around 70 to 75 years. If we were to add 30 years to the average lifespan of your average person, which we've done actually over the past 100 years through medical technology and kind of more information about diet and greater access to food, population stabilization would occur much later, meaning there'd be many more people than 10 billion. If we look at just Latin America, so this is world population, if we look at just Latin America in terms of population size, the trend's pretty similar since the start of the colonial period. Notice though this graph shows only the population in 1750 till today and a little bit beyond. And in 1750 it was pretty low in Latin America, around 15 million people. But remember, populations were much higher only 200 years earlier, before the Columbian Exchange, which included the exchange of viruses and illnesses. Population was higher. So disease and conquest caused a population crash. But today, population's recovered and growing. And particularly over the last 50 years or so, it's grown enormously. Today, population is just over 900 million people in all of Latin America and the Caribbean combined. This population growth is similar to the rest of the world, right, as I kind of mentioned before, but the percentage of global population that Latin America accounts for has actually risen quite dramatically over the past 50 years or so. So at this point, Latin America accounts for about 9% of the global population, and by 2150, this will probably be closer to 10%. And if you compare that to North America, so the US and Canada in this case, that's only 5% of the global population today, and our proportion of the global population really peaked in 1950 at 6.8%. Of course, that's nothing compared to Asia, which is the largest proportion, and followed by Africa and Europe, and then Latin America comes next. So that's what this shows us as the proportion of the global population that Latin America makes up. And you see, right in here, we're between 8 3/4 to 9% of the global population today. We've achieved some milestones in global population in the last couple hundred years. It's actually a pretty interesting subject. So in 1804, the global population hit 1 billion people, which is a pretty big benchmark. But 123 years later, we doubled that population. 33 years after that, we doubled it again. Okay, or we added another 1 billion. 14 years later, we add another billion. 13 years later, another 5 billion. And then our steps from 6 to 7 billion have been taken place over about 12 years. However, that 7 billion population mark that we hit in 2011, it was predicted that we would hit it in 2013. So we actually hit 7 billion people 2 years earlier than we were expecting, which doesn't bode well maybe for controlling population growth, if that's what we're interested in, over the next couple of milestones of 8 and 9 billion people. But projections are pretty clear that eventually population will stabilize between 9 and 10 billion people, really. We might shoot over 10.5 billion, let's say, but then come to rest around 9 billion people. Well, one thing to keep in mind is that people aren't spread evenly throughout the world. So people live, and we've referenced this a little bit in reference to South America, people live on the coasts, and they live in places where agriculture is good. Other things to notice about global population density is that Europe, India, and East Asia, so Europe, India, and East Asia are all very dense. In North America, you have concentrations along the East Coast megalopolis, Chicago, LA, San Francisco, Seattle, right? And in Latin America, you have the Central Valley of Mexico, the highland Colombia, coastal Venezuela up here, and around the cities of Salvador, Rio, Sao Paulo, Buenos Aires, Montevideo, and kind of in Argentina and Uruguay here. So people live in places with agriculture and places on the coast. That's kind of the take-home message there. And actually, density has changed quite a bit over time as well. As you might expect, we're not getting any more land, so you add more people to the mix, you end up with an increase in population density. And globally, we've moved from about 20 people per square kilometer up to 50.5 people per square kilometer in 2007, and we're projected to hit about 71, 72 people per square kilometer by the year 2050. So not even that far from now. And for those of you who work in miles, we're talking about 100 by 2050. We're talking about 186.5 people per square mile. Put that into the U.S. context, and we're like at 30-something people per square mile, or 60-something people per square mile. Sorry, that's a pretty interesting number, right? In terms of Latin America, the trend is similar, except the numbers are a little lower for Latin America. And that makes sense, because when we look at the region, we look at population density, there are huge areas where there are very few people in Latin America, in particular the Amazon basin, the Brazilian highlands, the Pampas, right, and Patagonia, and the kind of Atacama, high Atacama areas here. Latin America is actually 56% less dense than the global average. And, part of this is due to, these sparse areas I talked about. But, compared to many other parts of the globe, this area is not dense in terms of population. And that's because the area is very large, but populations are comparatively low. So if we look at population density in Asia, look at the number in 2007. It's so much bigger than Latin America's, right? And by 2050, we're looking at maybe 432 people per square mile. That's 167 people per square kilometer. 582 people per square mile by 2050, and about 20 people per square mile or square kilometer. If we put that in perspective, in the Midwest here, about 69 people per square kilometer is not that crazy. That's a pretty normal thing in the Midwest. And the U.S. as a whole is, 33 people per square kilometer or something like that. I mentioned it a second ago, right? In terms of Latin America and the Caribbean, the highest population density for the years kind of 2010 through 2013 is definitely Bermuda in the Caribbean, El Salvador in Central America, and Ecuador in South America. And the lowest are the Turks and Caicos in the Caribbean, Panama in Central America, and Suriname in South America. Check it out. Suriname has 3 people per square kilometer, and that makes it the least dense population in the region, and 6th least dense nation in the world. Now, there are a couple places on Earth with less population density, like Greenland or Svalbard, right? But these are places with like 3 people total and an enormous amount of land, so the effective density is 0. Suriname is a actual populated nation. It just doesn't have a very large population. Population densities globally, just to put it in context, if we don't count city-states like Singapore, Monaco, Gibraltar, or protectorates like Svalbard or Greenland, which are controlled by other nations. Bangladesh is the most densely populated country on Earth, with over 1,000 people per square kilometer in 2012. And the lowest population density goes to Greenland at 0.1 people per square kilometer. But Greenland's actually not an independent nation. It's governed by Denmark, and so Mongolia is the least dense independent nation out there with 2 people per square kilometer. And like I said before, this is the official number for this year, 35 people per square kilometer in the U.S. Remember, though, that includes Alaska, where not many people live, right? So, this number is effectively much higher in places with high population densities, relatively speaking, like, say, Indiana. Well, one thing, when you have this many people, you have to be concerned about how fast those populations are going to grow. And so when we talk about population and we're wondering what the future might be like, we actually look at something called the rate of natural increase. Well, the rate of natural increase is just the birth rate minus the death rate. And if you have a positive number after you do that subtraction, you're going to see a growing population. And if you see a negative number or a positive number, if you see a negative number, you're going to see a decreasing population. If you see a positive number, you see an increasing population. And we usually represent this as a percentage by which a population increases or decreases over the course of the year. Globally, that rate of increase is an average rate of about 1.2% per year. But in lesser developed nations, like many Latin American countries, 1.4% is actually common. And when you go to developed nations like the U.S. or Europe or Japan, we're looking at really more of a 0.1% growth per year, or rate of natural increase. As developed nations go, actually, the U.S. is more into repopulating the Earth than Europeans are, but it's not quite as exuberant in this task as Latin Americans are. So Latin America as a whole, you see a rate of natural increase of 1.3%. Interestingly, excluding China, the rest of Asia's population growth is exactly that of the global rate, or rather not that much higher than the global rate. Within Latin America, Guatemala, one of the region's least developed countries, has the highest rate of natural increase with 2.4%, but the lowest rate at the other end of the hemisphere is Uruguay, which is 0.4%. In the Caribbean, the highest is Haiti, and the lowest is Cuba. Well, who cares about this stuff? Well, that's a good question, and that brings up something known as the demographic transition model, which some of you hopefully have been exposed to before, but we're going to cover it in the next screencast.